Landlord-Tenant Disputes and its links to the rise of militarism. This video is about landlord-tenant disputes in Japan and how it's linked to the rise of militarism. This video was done because it's a difficult issue to understand because it's the first time that you've seen it in your history syllabus and maybe a bit difficult to imagine and understand this, especially if you're 15 or 16 years old. So let's begin with this. What are landlord-tenant disputes? In short, landlord-tenant disputes refer to conflicts or disagreements between a tenant, somebody who rents a land or rents a property from you, and their differences with the landlords. And the issues are over rental agreement or lease. Tenant farmers in the countryside are individuals or families who rent land from the landlord and they use it to grow crops or to raise livestock. They don't own the land themselves, but they have the right to use the land for a specified period of time in exchange for paying rent to the landlord. Rent can take the form of money. It can also take the form of a percentage of harvested crops. The disputes or quarrels between the landlord and the tenant can take many forms. Quarrels over rent prices, lease terms, how long you can work on the land, maintenance or repair issues, or maintenance over the irrigation or water systems, how much deposit you pay, and when you don't pay, being evicted from the land or your property, being asked to leave. These are all quarrels that they have. So in Japan, landlord and tenant disputes in the 1920s have existed for hundreds of years. Japan had a feudal system that existed for a long time, where a few powerful and wealthy owners held vast amounts of land and rented it to tenants. During the Meiji period, land was redistributed and there were many small landholders. In 1925, about 57% of all agricultural land are owned by small landholders. In other words, they own the land. However, despite the high percentage of small holdings, the majority of the agricultural production is still controlled by these powerful landlords who own the most productive and the best lands, and they rented it out to tenants or sharecroppers. The landlords were powerful and influential because they were members of the aristocracy or other elite groups. They lived in cities rather than in the rural areas, and they used their power and influence to maintain control over land and the tenants. They would rent out their land and they wanted tenants and sharecroppers to pay a portion of their harvest as rent. If you had an understanding and sympathetic landlord, when the harvest failed, that's no issue. But when you have a landlord who charges really high rents and imposes harsh working conditions on the tenants, they often lead to tenant-landlord disputes and social unrest. And if a tenant farmer or a sharecropper can't pay the rent, out you go. You're evicted and you're asked to leave your home. Overpopulation. Japan was also facing problems of overpopulation, and as a result, land became very scarce and expensive. In the Meiji period, the population was about 34 million, but by 1930, it was almost 58 million people. Having a large population helps because it helps in the modern industries like providing cheap labor for textile production, shipbuilding, steel production, and other modern industries in the cities. But in the rural areas, population growth leads to problems of land scarcity and limited food supply because people prefer to work in cities rather than work in the rural areas. Small holdings became overpopulated, often leading to poverty, food shortages, and tenant-landlord disputes. The government tried to address these issues through various kinds of land reform, but progress was slow and often limited by resistance from powerful landlords. There was a kind of power imbalance because due to the differences in power between the wealthy landlords and tenant workers, tenants in the countryside often faced challenges. They had unfair contracts, they had to pay high rent, they were often mistreated, and landlords often prioritized profits over the needs of the tenants. As a result, Many of the tenant farmers in the 1920s and the 1930s organized protests and strikes to demand better treatment and conditions. In some cases, these protests even turned violent, with clashes between tenant farmers and the police. Conditions for militarism. Landlord-tenant disputes in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s, as well as the kind of rural problems that you see, like the harvest failure and famine and riots and social unrest, they all created conditions for militarism to grow in Japan. Firstly, as the rural problems continued, some tenant farmers became more radical and they joined radical political movements. And ideas like socialism and communism became popular as a way to address their grievances. Others turned to more nationalist and militaristic groups, seeing this as a way to gain greater control of their lives and their livelihoods. The military was a way to resolve these problems, instead of turning to civilian government and the zaibatsus to solve their rural problems. Secondly, due to lack of opportunities in rural areas, especially in education, and the need to find jobs, many young men from the rural parts of Japan joined the military as a way to make ends meet. They saw this as a way for upward social mobility. In the 1930s, many became junior officers, and they began to hold more and more extremist and militaristic views on how to strengthen Japan. Many of the officers were young and ambitious and frustrated with the conservative leadership of the military. They wanted action and an aggressive foreign policy to expand Japan's power. They believed that the government and the military were controlled by a small group of wealthy and powerful elites, often landowners, who were not addressing the needs of ordinary people. They saw civilian government as holding back the growth of the military. So increasingly, these junior officers from rural backgrounds saw militarism as a way of returning power to the Japanese people, and they carried out assassinations, coup d'etats against civilian governments to put in place a military form of government. They created incidents like in Manchuria to expand Japan's overseas territories. They were all done in the name of loyalty to the emperor and to strengthen Japan as a world power. In turn, the military leadership, through its various factions and various groups, also exploited the grievances of the rural population. And such extremist views to gain influence and power in Japan's politics began to become popular. We'll talk about Kanji Ishiwara. Now, Kanji Ishiwara is a very important figure to understand because he grew up in a farming family and left home at the age of 15 to move to Tokyo to attend school. Then he became a junior military officer, and he believed in militarism, expansionism, the superiority of the Japanese race, and land reform to strengthen Japan. Ishiwara was a key player in the Mukden incident of 1931, which saw the Japanese army invade Manchuria. It marked the beginning of Japan's aggressive expansion in Asia. Also, Ishiwara represents the rural countryside officer who had ambitions of his own but was doing it in the name of Imperial Japan. In conclusion, landlord-tenant disputes show you the kind of rural discontent and the problems Japan faced. The feelings of discontent, injustice, and a desire for radical change made them lose faith in the democratic political system. Many of them, including those who joined the army, like Ishiwara, and they saw militarism and ultranationalism and aggressive foreign policy as a way to turn Japan into a world power.